Hello and welcome to a new episode of Once Upon a TV Time, the podcast that takes a look behind the scenes of some of the best shows on TV. I'm your host, Maureen Perrault. I'm a freelance journalist and TV critic, and on each episode of this podcast, I chat with someone who worked or works on the shows we discuss. Writers, directors, actors, craftsmen and women, you name it. They stop by to talk about what makes great TV and to tell us what goes on beyond our screens. This new episode of Once Upon a TV Time dives into one of my favorite shows currently on television. It just concluded its third run on AMC and AMC Plus, just landed here in the UK on BBC iPlayer, and is based on the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. I'm talking, of course, about the Vampire Lestat.
Are there any readers in the audience tonight? Have you come across this 2023 bodice ripper? Dubbed an irritating hoax, bound for flash in the pan status by Vanity Fair, and a thong-busting, steamy beach read for the sucking Fire Island set by Out magazine. Well, we are the tribute band spawned by that literary mountaintop.
But before we talk about this Rockstar vampire and I introduce you to today's guest, allow me some housekeeping. If you've been enjoying previous episodes of this podcast, I invite you to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. And that's where you'll find all the latest information about upcoming episodes. Also, if you don't mind me asking, please leave us a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to this to help put this show into more ears. Okay, enough shop talk. Let's talk about the inner turmoil of Lestat de Lyoncourt. Today, I'm joined by none other than the man who figured out what Lestat's rock and roll world looks like, production designer Andres Cubillan. Andres joined the interview with the Vampire Universe in Season 3, and before this, you may have seen his work as an art director in Mindhunter or The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and as a production designer for Gentified and Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. Andres is currently working on the upcoming live-action adaptation of Tangled, but he's taking some time out of his busy schedule to tell us about the work he's done for the Vampire Lestat. Andres, welcome, and thank you for joining me. I'm very excited to talk to you about the Vampire Lestat. But before we dive into the show, I want to talk a little bit about you and your work and your career.
Okay.
So I saw in your credits that you've worked as an art director and as a production designer. Would you mind explaining for the listeners what's the difference between those two roles?
Yes, absolutely. The production designer is the person that's in charge of the overall look of the show. And, everything from sort of color palette and atmosphere, and production designers are the ones that determine architectural style, and they sort of fill in the blanks of what is sort of, telling about a character that's missing in the script. The difference then with the art directors execute that vision for the production designer. So we sort of take that minutia and we work on the development and construction of the sets and making sure the communication with all departments is flowing, and we work with visual effects and special effects and really just focusing on making that vision come to life.
Nice. And how does one progress from one role to the next?
I think it really comes from experience. I've always wanted to be a production designer. I went to school for architecture because I thought I knew I wanted to be a designer, but I wasn't entirely sure what kind of designer I wanted to be. And I thought architecture might give me the most rounded education, which it did. I went to an art school. I went to RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and there I learned graphic design and furniture and industrial design and film. And I think it's a really well-rounded arts background and education. But then, my father was very insistent about me working summers, and I worked at architecture firms, and as educated as that was, it will also sort of it made me realize that it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. And then lo and behold, sort of film, it kind of clicked. I'd always been a bit of a cinephile, and I just loved movies, and the fact that I could combine sort of my passion for architecture and the passion for film together. So I, moved to Los Angeles. I started working, and then I actually got a master's in production design from the American Film Institute Conservatory. And it's in that collaboration you start working with directors and producers, cinematographers, editors, and you sort of realize what all of these people do and what they bring to sort of the world of film. So I always knew that once I got out of AFI, I knew that I always wanted to sort of start at the bottom and really work my way up. So I really understood sort of what everybody did. So I went from a PA to an art department coordinator to then an assistant art director, an art director. And I think art directors, you kind of have that responsibility of filling in the gaps in sort of our you need to know about set design, you need to know about graphic design, you need to know about all of these things because those are the people that you're supervising. So I think art direction, sorry, it just gives you such a preparation for then sort of being able to sort of put your ideas to use and putting those ideas forward and then, really diving in as a production designer.
What's your favorite thing about it, about being a production designer?
Oh, I love the invisible detail. I mean, secretly, I want everybody to see those details, but just for me to know that those details are there, and hopefully an actor will notice them, and that will sort of help their performance. I think that's really sort of such a gratifying thing, and we had so many of those moments on the Vampire Lestat that it just it kind of warms my heart, and then I'm able to sort of walk away with a smile on my face, and I'm like, oh, okay, they're having fun, and it's helping sort of that story move along. Yeah, I love a good Easter egg.
Yeah, everybody does.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Vampire Lestat. How did you end up working on season 3 of Interview with the Vampire?
So, funnily enough, I'm a good friend of Mara Lapierre-Sloop, who designed the first two seasons of the show. She had actually called me to be her supervising art director on the first season, but I was unfortunately not available to join her. I trained under her when she was an art director. I was her assistant art director, and then she moved up, and I moved up, and Mara ended up calling me out of the blue for this, and just said, I've been talking to the showrunners. I think I'm going to do another show, but I think the show really needs a new voice. This new season is going to be completely different. They're trying to sort of reboot their own show. It's a completely different sort of storyline and visual style, and I think they could use a different eye for this. And I was incredibly grateful. She put my name into the hat, and I don't think I've ever worked this hard on a presentation in my life. I think, but I just really wanted it. It's a show that is so not only beautiful, but it's incredibly rich as a story. It's incredibly sort of attuned to the books that Anne Rice and that wrote and that incredible fandom. So you need to sort of do it justice. It's not something that you're going to sort of throw together and put some cool things on screen. It really needed to be sort of deep, and that's exactly the kind of show that I love to do. So yeah, it worked out that way, and I'm incredibly lucky.
How much research did you have to do? Were you familiar with the books?
I was not familiar with the books. I actually, yeah, I was like listening to the audiobook of The Vampire Lestat, reading like cliff notes of of Interview with a Vampire, because I had obviously, seen both seasons. I had watched the movie, and there's just so many liberties taken, and Rollin likes to sort of pull from different books. So there's, we're doing things that are like three books ahead, and we're laying all those little sort of clues to what's going to happen in the future. So it was sort of a multi-sensory experience of reading the cliff notes and listening to the audiobook and also like pulling images and just, I think I had maybe 1,800 images pulled before my first meeting. And I was like, it just, you kind of go down that rabbit hole of trying to figure out the character's state of mind. And it was just, I'm like, oh, a picture of bloody hands. This is amazing. I don't know what for, but this is incredible. And you just sort of, you go down that sort of inspiration rabbit hole.
Yeah. And like you said, so this season is sort of a reboot. It gets a brand new title, and it hits the reset button because it switches point of view from Louis to Lestat. And I was wondering, how did you approach rebooting the visual tone and language of the show to match Lestat's ego?
I think I never wanted to erase sort of the work of the first two seasons. Fortunately, we are in a different era, which gives me some freedom to sort of reinterpret that to a degree. But for me, it was sort of trying to take the choices that Mara made in the first season, which is really the only time that we see a space that is Lestat's, that
Mhm.
house. And what is his stylistic evolution throughout the decades? How do we turn up the volume now for sort of a present day Lestat? And I've said this before that to me back then he was still sort of assimilating into society. He's hiding, not only being a vampire, but he's hiding sexuality. He's hiding all of these things of himself in that time, in that era where, sort of deviating away from the norm wasn't acceptable. And I think this era now, our story is 2025, but let's say 2026, I think he's finally able to sort of live boldly and sort of out loud. I think there's less assimilation. I think when we first see him, we are seeing a Lestat that is as much himself as we've ever seen. So trying to capture the multitudes of a 250 plus year old vampire is hard enough as it is. But how do you layer a character that has gone through all of that emotional trauma? And even though he is living boldly, what is he covering up? So there is, I think we all do it sort of in our own lives and in our own spaces. So yeah, I think I'm at this point, I don't know if I'm entirely answering your question, but
No, you
his
are. You
his
are. There
yeah,
is there
okay.
is a lot of layers to Lestat, and that's a progression that you needed to show, while also, like you said, like and as he admits himself, he is very much still hiding from himself. So
Yeah.
what he's presenting to the world, is it Lestat or is it still a version of Lestat?
Yes, I think that's sort of the interesting thing that our showrunners kind of put out there. I don't think, I think a lot of people have been questioning, like, well, this is also still in a version of him, just like it was Louis' version of him before. And I think it's one of those sort of, manifestation sort of lifestyles where I think he's trying to say like, okay, this is me. I have my things together. I can now sort of move on with my life. Maybe I can reconnect with Louis, and then it sort of all goes to hell. So it's just, what is that? How do those sort of different stages kind of break apart in his life?
Yeah, and like we said, so this season dives into this that story, and to do that, it has to bounce rapidly between historical centuries and this hyper modern rock world. What was the most challenging visual transition for you to anchor in the same season those aspects, and how did you keep the overall world cohesive?
I usually gravitate towards color. For me, color is sort of the answer to most questions, and I think I have a good eye for color, but it's still something that I struggle with because it's just there's just so much out there. You want to. So for me, it was a sort of a color story of saying, look, I'm skipping between two incredibly drastic times in his life, between sort of that 18th century France and then sort of present day US. And I wanted to be able to sort of tell a color story. The everything sort of in the 18th century is very sort of pale and dusty. It's not that it's not colorful, it's just not vibrant. And I think there's something even in the lighting quality of a space then and a space now, and not just sort of fire versus electricity, but I think there's something a little chalkier about that time. So it was a matter of being able to use the exact same colors, just pumping up the volume or dimming it down to sort of be able to make that visual connection between the two timelines. And then there's also sort of the rock star element of it. I think the approach was to have it be a little grotesque. He's got this sort of, hyper drive and sort of nasty version of sort of mortals, and especially mortals across the US to a degree. So I think it was I needed it to feel jarring, and then sort of that in contrast with sort of that softness and that sort of quietness and stillness of the 18th century.
Yeah, and also those two aspects of of his personality, right? Like young Lestat was much more quiet.
Yes, 100%. But there's such a I think there's such a bubbling anger inside him that during that time. So he is very contained. It's sort of the stammering aspect of it, of his stutter, is so magnificent because it just feels like he's just trying so hard to kind of get it out, get it out, get it out, and he can't. And I think that mimics so beautifully into the future as well because he's also trying to get it out and he can't.
Yeah. You've mentioned colors, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about materials. Lestat is very much, a creature of intense, like sensory
Mm,
indulgence. And were there specific materials, fabrics, or textures like leather, velvets,
yes.
stone that became like your go-to anchors to place in his world?
Yes. We wanted to, first of all, we wanted to sort of avoid certain sort of vampiric tropes. In like we try to avoid the colors black and red as much as we could. Wherever we see red, it's sort of very intentional. But and I think it was sort of the same thing with leather. And I had a fantastic sort of working collaboration with Lex Wood, our costume designer, and we kind of let the leather be part of the costume and not part of his environment.
Mhm.
So I have very little leather. I think I have like two leather chairs in the entire show. There's something about them. There's the interview chair that's leather, but then he's in like a crushed velvet and like linen. So it's just the materials are constantly. I needed them to feel tactile and incredibly sort of sensual. So the walls are like really glossy, smooth plaster because I needed that to feel super slick. I have sort of a lot of velvet. The banquettes in the bus are velvet. Both of his sofas in his house are velvet. Even the curtains are this beautiful combination of like a caramel velvet and a navy blue silk that are my decorator Summer Gall brought to me, and it is just that it makes it so. Just by looking at them, you can already feel them. So there's a strong sort of tactile element to everything in the set that we try to do. A lot of sort of marble, and trying to bring in sort of glossy materials that aren't reflective, purely reflective. So we have some like hammered copper in his house next to polished marble with then rough marble. That sort of really rich caramel wood screen. So it's a combination of making things feel cold but also very welcoming. Even in the bus, his cabinet where the piano is, that's an overglazed ceramic in front of sort of, a suede lined but then chrome cabinet for his guitar and his violin. So it's constantly sort of giving you something warm and something cold at the same time.
Yeah, it's kind of like that shiny versus muted. Yeah.
Yes.
Quiet on set. So, could you state your name for the camera, please?
I'm the front man. Lestat.
The Vampire Lestat.
I'm immortal, more or less. The light of the sun, the sustained heat of an intense fire. Jefferson's starship. Grot-wielding coven members. These things might destroy me, but then again, they might not.
You've mentioned the bus. Let's dive into some of the amazing sets you made for this season, and I feel like we have to start with the bus because it's an insane
Yes.
bus. Let's begin with the ground level because it feels so raw and grimy and lived in compared to the top.
Mhm.
I think I read somewhere, yeah, on Instagram. I think I read you explained that it needed to feel like a used tour bus that was like, you go and have this space and I'll take the upstairs. And the upstairs is the
Yes.
only place that's actually remodeled. But what was the thought process behind that contrast?
Yeah, I mean, it was exactly that. We needed to show right off the bat in a very sort of single shot his sort of disdain for anyone other than himself. So it's, because we don't even see sort of the what we call the chlamydial dressing room until later in the episode. So we really just see that wild party, disgusting side of being sort of a rock and roll star to then really transition into, okay, but this is me. This is elegance. This is luxury. This is bespoke. So we had sort of initially we were trying to sort of make it all fit within a single level, and we realized that Lestat would never be okay with just this amount of space, and he would probably have the band go sleep in a van somewhere else. So we went into the doubles, into the two-story bus, and yeah, the backstory was that he had sort of bought this used bus off of a hard partying rock and roll band and just basically kind of hosed it down. He has kind of let the band do whatever they want to do downstairs, and he just remodeled the entire interior upstairs. And very early on, we knew that everything in that space, in his space, needed to feel completely custom made for him. So how do we then contrast that with the downstairs, that it needed to feel completely found and cheap? So it was a lot of Formica and sort of like it was a leopard print rug. I had seen this, in doing all my research, I found, present day tour buses. I saw that, Taylor Swift had taken out sort of the custom built-ins in her bus, and she had put in this like really big comfy couch in there that to this day I still don't know how they put it in there, how they brought it in there. But we wanted to do that in a way, and my decorator brought in this gorgeous sort of almost like a metallic crushed velvet sofa, and then we just my scenic painters did unthinkable things to it and just really destroyed it, and cigarette burns and the miscellaneous stains. And I think it was a set that everybody had a lot of fun destroying, you know giving all of the characters, even though we're never really, the band members were not spending a lot of time with them, but we wanted to sort of give them a little glimpse of personality. We have sort of chewing gum climbing up the wall and into the floor, into the ceiling, and we were just sort of giving Salamander this sort of routine that, after every show, he would take his gum out and just kind of stick it on the wall. What are the things that they collect while they're on tour? They're sort of picking up random crap, and some groupie left her bra, and there's, a disgusting condom stuck to the wall. So it's just all of these things. We needed to give it a lot of layering. I think, like I said, our set tech department had a blast in there. Just, every time I would go in there, I'm like, no, more. And they would be like, really, more? I'm like, yep, more. Let's go more. Let's go heavier. And the same with our scenic team. The painters kept saying like, "Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, let's throw more in there." And after each episode, we would add more. We would, change things around. There's a couple of sort of bus transformations that didn't make it into the final cut, but we had put in like a fortune telling machine in there, and they had probably stolen that from some arcade that they had stopped on the way. Sort of what was that accumulation of things as they go. In contrast, then, with the top of the bus, it was more about sort of that stillness, that luxury. There's something sort of uninhibited. There, not sort of. It's completely he is completely uninhibited. There is nothing that he's not willing to sort of show the world. He's not hiding anything. I had originally thought of a shower, and it was sort of a closet shower for Lestat, that when you opened it, it became sort of Botticelli's The Venus, the painting, except there was no Venus. It's Lestat standing on a, mother of pearl shell, and that's sort of the tub. And, we were just sort of, how do we fit the space in? And it just wasn't working as much as we tried. And one of my concept artists, I was like, well, we need a chandelier. How about here? And he was like, oh, what if the chandelier's a shower too? And I was like, oh, that's a fantastic idea. I wish I could take credit, but I can't. It was one of the beautiful things about collaboration. I'll say that, where, you bring in an idea and your team just makes it better. And then Rollin was like, well, what if it's also a blood shower? And I'm like, oh, well, I mean, then we take it to the stratosphere. That's an even better idea. And, when we first see, we had made even the windows on either side of the shower lower. And Rollin and I had come up with this idea that we were never able to shoot of, the bus is standing at a stoplight next to a minivan, and there's just this like family gawking through the window at a naked Lestat taking a shower because he doesn't care. None of the windows have blinds or shades because, again, he doesn't care. Even the revolving coffin coffee table, which was in the script as being on a Lazy Susan. And when I was first doing floor plans for this, I kept telling Rollin, I'm like, I can't fit all of this space in with a revolving 8-foot coffin in the middle of the room because there's just, people can't put their feet down. And he was like, exactly. Like that doesn't matter. So, and it's those little conversations that you have with people that know these characters frontwards and backwards that all of a sudden make all these other things click. And as soon as Rollins said, yeah, let other people pick up their feet if he wants to spin this coffin around, that's Lestat. He's the center of the universe. It doesn't matter. And I'm like, oh my God, like this is all of a sudden all these things sort of click and make sense. So it was really about making Lestat's space just purely his. We have sort of like a sun god, sort of dangling chandelier above the coffin, collections also of little ridiculous things that he would find on tour. So there's a jackalope in the corner and this little sort of plastic lamp from Florida that he would have picked up. So it's just being able to be a little playful with it as well, making sure that it wasn't serious.
Yeah. I want to go back on a couple of things you mentioned there. First, the coffin. I really like that imagery of the hands. It's on
Yeah.
the side of the bus, it's on the floor, you have all of those hands. It's giving like crowd surfing, and Lestat is just being carried by those hands that are carrying his coffin. What does that aspect of this set say about his relationship with fame?
In the first episode, when he's talking to baby Jenks in that sort of surreal moment, he's seeing her soul sort of stuck to the ceiling. He's very clear that he wants to be loved by millions. I think this is a way of sort of him justifying this journey that he's on, being able to say, I won't be defined as this milquetoast villain by this stupid book because you're not even representing me correctly. So I think it's a matter of him being able to sort of justify what he's doing and really say, no, I'm right, you are wrong. And the hands, it sort of worked a little backwards, where I had come up with the idea of hands gripping the coffin just as a way of me saying, how does this coffin stay in place? Because it's the same coffin that then gets lifted out and taken into the Detroit hotel, and he doesn't have two coffins. This is his coffin. So how does that thing sort of come in and out, and how does it not fall out and move around? So I had this idea of sort of these hands gripping it, and then there was a version of the script that called the bus the coffin. And I was like, well, then if the bus is the coffin, then, is that sort of what informed the graphic outside? And those first sort of ideas in production meetings of him crowd surfing, and all of a sudden it made sense that he is being both held up by this desire of people, but at the same time really being pulled down. We kind of see how that evolves throughout the season, of being sort of raised up and really being pulled down into this darkness. So that's what sort of informed the floor, all of these hands traveling across the floor to then really raise him up and hold him in place. For whether it's good or bad, I think at times it feels like it's a good thing, and at other times it's gonna definitely feel bad, especially in episode 7. So then the bus ended up having that. I think it's a complicated issue for him to be that he wants to be loved. I think it's sort of part of his being abandoned so many times by people, being sort of betrayed, and not that he's guiltless in any of this by all means, but I think that's sort of what he's seeing. That's what he's sort of feeling, and Rollin might correct me if I'm wrong there, but that's sort of what I interpreted it.
Yeah. No, I think it's a fair assessment
Yeah.
of Lestat's mindset, and especially at the beginning of the season and at the end, because like you were mentioning the crowd surfing, and in the finale there's this moment where he says, I was about to dive into the audience there, and he doesn't.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
when you're talking about him not wanting, like being pulled by the crowd, I think that's kind of like what he is afraid of then, and
Yeah.
why he doesn't do it.
And I think in that moment, I think he finally shows some growth. I think he's sort of understanding this is unnecessary. This is not, I don't need this anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go back to that shower, because there's something you said that made me wonder, what came first? Was the script like Lestat as a shower in the middle of his tour bus, and you were like, we need a shower? Or were you toying with the idea of the shower, and then Rollin went, let's have him take a blot shower in front of Armand, and that's how the shower came to be?
Yeah, there wasn't anything about a shower or a toilet in the script. There was, we mentioned that there needed to be a piano, there needed to be the sort of the revolving coffin, there needed to sort of be life and luxury around him. That was sort of the parameters given. But because in the first script, Rollin very specifically wrote about vampires peeing blood, all of a sudden it gave us something. I didn't want it to be sort of like the Brady Bunch bathroom that, you never see a toilet on something like that. I wanted all of a sudden to give him something normal that everyone does, even a vampire in whatever phase it is. So that's why I sort of started with this banquet of, does he wash his face? Does he wash his hands? Does he wake up in the morning? What is that routine? Like I had given him sort of a closet at one point, and then through conversations with Rollin and Hannah and Lex, and we were like, I don't think he's necessarily picking his clothes. Like he's not sort of rummaging through drawers picking a shirt. I think he's sort of, maybe a stylist comes in and says, I have these shirts for you. What would you like? Or he might point at somebody and say, you know what, that's a really cool shirt. I'm going to take that now. So we wanted to sort of give him that liberty, but at the same time really ground him on normal activities that we would all do. So I started with the shower. Like I said, I needed a chandelier. I hadn't figured out where to put the shower. For a while, it was, there was like a tub hidden under one of the banquettes. So he would sort of lift the lid and he would get into the tub, and then the chandelier was above that, and that would become the shower. And then I think at that point I pitched that to Rollin, and Rollin said, "Oh, let's just put that in the middle of the room. Like why are we sticking ourselves into the corner?"
On
And
full
sort of
display.
totally full display, and my logical brain goes, oh, but where does the water go, or it's going to splash everywhere. And I think those are the things that I needed to sort of let go of, to really understand Lestat and the fact that he wouldn't care. And it wasn't until they had written the scene of Armand coming into the bus to apologize, to do his sort of amends to Lestat, that Rollins said, how hard would it be to turn that into a blood shower? And that, again, sort of takes it to a whole new level. And even having something as, sort of everyday, three buttons on the ceiling. We had put three little sort of human hearts on each of the buttons. One was yellow, one was blue, one was red. And it's such a silly little detail. But the fact that he would just sort of slowly reach up and just turn off the blood and turn on the water. We had fortunately pushed the shoot of the interior of the bus later on in the schedule. So we knew that blood scene was coming. So we actually added blood splatter on the velvet banquettes, and it's never addressed. No one ever sees it. But the idea was, what if somebody actually, they're like, what's splattered on the side of the banquettes there? Like it gives you a little foreshadowing of what's to come. I love that one of the, when I posted about this on Instagram, there was a comment about like, oh, but aren't they going to get mildewy, or where does this drain? And I love that people think that, because that's how I think. But I think the banquettes, he would have been like, just get rid of them, reupholster them, or I don't
Yeah.
like these anymore, get rid of them. We actually put in on the bottom floor, you can see the sort of the ring of the drain under his shower in the bottom of the bus as well. And we actually made it so that it actually looks like it's leaking a little bit, and it's actually leaking into some of the bunk beds of the band members. And it's like just to really heighten this disgusting experience that they are on, but that Lestat couldn't give a crap about. Yeah.
So they start to be like, I don't care where it drains. I don't even
Yeah,
care if it
exactly.
drains.
I don't even care if it drains, exactly.
So when it comes to putting Lestat on stage, how did you envision creating those concert spaces that truly made him shine as a rock star?
I think the venues, because he's not playing these sort of gigantic venues, I started looking at research of what these sort of small and medium sort of sized venues are, not just from when I go to concerts, but also just sort of across the world and across the US. And the stages are very basic. There's nothing really behind any of these bands other than, there's a black backdrop. Sometimes there's a banner that says the band's name, or there's something like that. So we purposefully kept it incredibly bare just to let him be star of the show. And really, our cinematographers, David Tattersall and Earl Dresner, just really had fun with the lighting and what that evolution of his show would be. I'd mentioned this before, where I think it became sort of second nature to Summer Gall, my decorator, and I, to just, the stage set became sort of very simplistic. And we were like, oh, yep, instruments and platforms and carpets are all sort of in the regular positions. And, that it just became sort of very normalized. And it wasn't until episode 6 that we really did something really special, because that was leading into a much bigger show. But yeah, Rollin in every aspect always said eyes always on Lestat.
Hmm.
So I didn't want to add any, I had done concepts with like light bars on the back, or some kind of the Vampire Lestat logo, like light up things, and all of them took away from Lestat. So we said, you know what, let's just leave it black, leave it simple, whatever material that is behind him, and let's him be the star.
Let's travel back in time a little bit and talk about the Château d'Aurillac in Auvergne. Stepping first into the dining room, because here is the long table, a long table that we're going to hear about a lot during the whole season, and that
Yes.
becomes a key element of the finale. But I'm curious first to hear how that space was designed to tell the story of a declining family.
I think that was the tricky thing, was that's the only space in the chateau that we see other than his bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
And we needed to be able to tell sort of the decades of progression in this family's life. And we purposefully made it so that it wasn't a flowery, sort of frilly, sort of Louis XVI type of chateau. It really needed to feel a lot older. So we went purposefully with like a 15th century chateau, something that would be far more stark and cold and sort of simplistic in its details. So a really high wainscot and, sort of stone walls above that. We had a little fun, painting sort of, decorative details on the raftered ceiling. But knowing that all of this action was happening around this very long table, is how do we make this space feel interesting enough? I looked at, over, God, I want to say maybe 20 different chateaus, sort of across France. It made me incredibly jealous for a very long time, because I was like, oh God, all of these incredible spaces. And, I think you should let me build an entire chateau, because it was just really just, research is like my favorite thing. And then we ended up settling on just, 2 chateaus that just had that right feel for the family. And then Summer Gall and I, we kind of sat together, and we sort of tried to figure out what are the different stages. We thought, would this family be selling things off? The place settings around the table get simpler. You start seeing sort of furniture go away, tapestries go away. You see sort of the room get dingier. So the fireplace, like they're not cleaning it regularly. So you start seeing the smoke coming up the front of the fireplace. You start seeing sort of water stains running down the walls. We wanted it to feel kind of shabby at the end. I think we ended up taking sort of, candelabras away. So it's far, to really sort of strip it down. We have an incredibly sort of elaborate banquet feast at the beginning, and they're sort of just disgustingly eating their food in front of their starving people that they're supposed to protect. So, and then at the end, it's like, I think he's just drinking some soup, I think. And, we just had sort of needed some bread and some cheese. And not that this family would be starving in any way, but I think I didn't think about this, because that's, sort of outside of my purview. But I loved that one of the fans sort of pointed out that you can tell that they're not a wealthy family, because Augustin's wife is breastfeeding herself. She's breastfeeding her child. And that wouldn't have been the norm back then. There would have been a wet nurse. So it's those little details that I didn't realize, I didn't pick up on. I love that a fan can, just sort of look at that and point it out and being like, yes, it's so clear. Look at that. So yeah, that was it. I think it, David Tattersall lit it so beautifully, and the room just starts to just really mute down, really just dim and darken. And it just feels so, especially when Lestat has his sort of final straw and kind of gets up to go kill the wolves. That room is stale. Like, you can feel that the air can't circulate in that room, and I love that film can make you feel that way.
it's a very interesting space, and as you mentioned, the only other place we see in the chateau is the stat bedroom, and you've mentioned on Instagram that it was one of your favorite sets
It
to
was,
make this
yes.
season. What are some of the details that you put in that room that shed some light on his upbringing?
The murals on the wall. I was particularly in love with that concept. In my head his room was always going to be small. It was always going to be an awkward shape. I wanted him to feel like he had just sort of been thrown into one of the last rooms there because he's the brunt of the family. But the murals, I was like, what is if he's going to be in that room for his whole life or for until he sort of leaves home, and it's again, he's not getting it redecorated or changed up in any way. What is the sort of the 18th century or 16th century, however long that room has been there, version of sort of the quintessential little boy's room? And I liked, so it's just, it's not little boats and trains and cowboys. It's these scenes of like wars and massacre, all of these things that are quote unquote supposed to make you a man and supposed to make you strong. And I loved the idea of giving him such a sort of traumatic environment from the get-go, from being a little boy and being sort of surrounded by this darkness. And then in contrast, the ceiling, which I've mentioned will always break my heart that we never get to see, was these really heavy wood rafters, and they were painted pink with like greens and yellows, and I loved the contrast of having something so heteronormatively feminine on top of something so, again, heteronormatively masculine in that space, and how that one thing would sort of weigh down on top of another to really oppress him down. I loved that set. I loved that set. It was it felt so appropriate for him.
Yeah. Rewatching that scene, I was also struck by something you said about the flooring and how
Yes.
it's not the type of flooring you would have in a child's bedroom, but more like it reminded me as because I'm French and I've been in chateaus and I've seen this type of
Hmm.
of flooring, and you typically
Hmm.
see it a little more in like the kitchen.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it was, yeah, like I was like, oh, it's interesting that his family has kind of put him into the let's put him in this room, like the one that's not really been thought through to be a child's bedroom.
Yes, exactly. I think, the rest of the family would have, maybe beautiful parquet flooring in their rooms and things like that. And in in my head he wasn't like directly in a servant's quarters, but I wanted to give him the sort of the servant's sort of version of a chateau. And I think the tile flooring, it felt incredibly appropriate, and again sort of the coldness and the warmth. It's constantly sort of playing between the two things.
Let's pivot to another cold space. Magnus's tower.
Yes.
It has to do a lot of heavy lifting in a
Mm.
small amount of time.
Mhm.
We see it very quickly in the first half of the season. What
Mhm.
was the visual inspiration for that space, and how did you convey Magnus's story with so little screen time?
There was never a way that I was going to be able to do sort of Anne Rice's writing justice with that set and in the screen time that we had. It's some very, very quick snippets, and I think a lot of people were sort of surprised that I was even building a set like that for such a quick beat, but it was such an impactful beat. It is, it's so horrific and so traumatizing, and there was no way that we were ever going to pull a location out of our butts to kind of make this work. And fortunately for me, I'll say that, Mara at the end of season two, she had done sort of the bottom of this tower, and they had built this sort of spiral wood staircase that was in shambles. So I knew that I needed to connect both things, but it gave me freedom to what that would be. So we took some reference of Gothic towers, and there's one that's, I think it's technically in Paris, and I wish my memory were better for the names, and I could just is it Saint Jacques? Is it it might be Saint Jacques. And that, the fact that it's sort of this solitary tower. I like the idea that he would have no place to escape, so immediately he needed to be the top of the tower. And how do we make that feel oppressive and heavy? We had a couple of ideas of, I wanted the stained glass windows, and I love the idea of having these sort of religious figures sort of looking down mercilessly and sort of in judgment at him. And also, we couldn't figure out where to hide the riches, Magnus's riches, or how to insinuate the fact that he was wealthy, or where to put the bodies, because it wasn't a very big set. It was a very small set, actually, and you know, we actually made it bigger for episode 7 because the table wouldn't fit. So we actually had to cut it in half, push it apart, and add to it in order to make it fit. So we couldn't figure out where these bodies would be, and in conversations with Claudia Josa, our director for 303, we came up with this sort of hanging bodies chandelier above Magnus when he's on his date, on his sort of dream date with Lestat. So immediately, sort of the verticality of it was incredibly important. And, we don't actually get to see that, unfortunately, but like on top of that were just trunks and trunks. On top of that walkway, we had a bunch of trunks and things like that. And so, sort of to insinuate that there is more to the space than what we're seeing. With that said, the way that Lestat tells the story, and it's this sort of fantastical moment, it needed to feel a little theatrical in my head, at least, and so it needed to sort of stay bare. I think the sort of the central focus to let Lestat go through this sort of horrific thing and have nothing else sort of compete around him. And so that's sort of what the conception of it was.
Yeah, because again, we are in Lestat's point of view, so who knows if that's what the tower really looks like. But it has,
Exactly.
yeah, that element of a stage, because it's, yeah, very much in that episode, Lestat is staging the story of Magnus and what
Yeah, like
happened
at the
between them.
beginning of the song, he comes out of the Renault Theater, and it's just these crystal chandeliers with pink and blue lighting. So it's already giving us the element of romanticized fantasy. We kept saying it was sort of like an 80s music video. Magnus is sort of twirling in the darkness and these sort of
Yeah.
floating heads, and it took us all so long to, I kudos to Roland Jones and his insane head, because he had it so clear in his head, and he was like, no, 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 this is going to work, and it's going to be so amazing. And the rest of us were like, I don't know, like, it's an 80s music video in the middle of this really horrific story. And it wasn't until it was cut together that we were all like, oh my God, like,
Yeah.
magnificent, just magnificent. It's just sort of so beautifully poetic.
It's such a great sequence, and especially how, like you said, you watch it like an 80s music video, and then you realize what it's really about and what really happened, and when you rewatch it, you're just horrified.
Horrified. Yeah. It's incredible.
But that space, the Magnus's tower, comes back, like you mentioned, in the finale. And I
Mhm.
was actually going to ask you if you had to build a smaller table, but you answered it. You
We
actually
we
built the
also
bigger
had to do
space.
that.
Oh
We
yeah,
also
okay.
had to build a smaller table.
Because I was like, wait, that giant table fit in that space. But how did you navigate that, designing Magnus's like space so that it would retroactively fit the long table? Did you know from the get-go that it was going to come back?
No, we did not. I was almost going to tear the set down because we needed the space for another set, and Roland kept saying, Hold on, hold on. I don't know how I'm going to use it exactly yet, but I'm going to use it. So don't take it down." And when he finally brought us sort of the pages for episode 7, it. I'm so glad that I didn't tear those sets down, because we were really tight on space. So I was really ready to start chopping them down. But I think it was, we quickly understood the weight of
Yeah.
why the long table was in these particular spaces. So we made a slightly smaller table, and one that was a little lighter. I think that the one in the chateau was actually, we had to build steel into it because, Gabriella was going to run on it, and we knew it was going to flip over, and it's an incredibly long table. I think it was 18 feet long. So we made sort of a small smaller one that could travel also because it goes out into the field and it also needed to fit into the recording studio. Luckily, the big one fit into the Paris apartment. But yeah, all of a sudden, we tried to make it work. I think we were all standing in Magnus's apartment, with a tape measure and, Alan Taylor, the director, staring at me being like, it doesn't fit. It's going to be too tight. And I was like, yeah. Uh, and it's just sort of this like awkward back and forth and I was like, let me figure this out. Maybe there's a way that we can make this work. And then I need to go talk to all the other departments. And I'm like, can we achieve this in 2 weeks? We have such little time to kind of do it. But we understood how important it was to get it done.
Yeah. It tells you so much about how television is made, right? Like the fact
Oh yeah.
that it's evolving as you shoot. The last episodes are maybe not fully written, and then you have to figure out how things are going to go back. And yeah,
It's
fascinating. It's
I
organized chaos.
It's organized chaos, very much so. It's a testament at least to Hannah and Rollin in that we had an idea of where it was going. They had given us every what I Rollin in particular. I love that whenever you go in to sort of talk to him, he's already sort of mid-sentence. And being new to the team, he's talking about things from season one, and I'm like, I wasn't there. I don't know what you're talking about. Or he's talking about book six, and I'm like, I am also not there. That's like that's like three books away. But because he and Hannah understand these characters so profoundly, they were able to sort of tell us where they were planning on taking the season. So even though we didn't have the scripts, we didn't know exactly where it was going. I think at most we had up to episode 5. So it was really 6 and 7 that were the ones that were sort of, later to the game. It's very much a testament sort of television. It's and on a show like this, how to maintain the quality because this show its legacy. It's incredibly lush and detailed and meaningful in everything that is put into the screen. So how do we maintain that quality, that level of detail in such a short amount of time is insane.
I wonder if you can shed some light for me on perhaps some of the conversations that were going on around episode 7 and these spaces that the table was going to travel to. The one that particularly caught my eye was the fact that when Gabriella becomes chair of
Mm,
this judgment, whatever you want to call it, it transitions not only to her appearance as Lestat's mother, but to
mm.
the Paris Paris apartment.
Apartment.
We leave the tower and we go there.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, why do we go there and not back to Aurillac?
For us, that's where she was transformed.
Okay.
So that's where she's transformed. She's still his mother, but it's sort of 18th century Gabriella, and it needed to sort of bring back the weight of her coming into his life with Nikki. I kept I recently found a picture of 3 period coffins. There's a scene where Nikki is sort of going mad and he's sort of at the end of his story. We actually had written in that there were 3 coffins in the bedroom. Like the bed is gone and now there are 3 coffins in the bedroom. And I had built 2 coffins that were sort of more elaborate and beautiful and silk lined. And then there was one that was sort of the more plain one. And it was very much, here's Lestat and Gabriella, and then there's Nikki. So it
Mm-hmm.
was very much a mother makes 3. So the importance of going back to the Paris apartment was all of sort of the chaos that her presence in that apartment made.
Yeah, and I also felt like, yeah, it was because there's the importance of that space for Lestat, right? And so it made sense to me that Aurillac would not be a place he goes back to, but the woods are, because the woods are
Mm,
where there was the wolf fight, where he saw the witches burn and all that. So
yes.
yeah, trumps the dining room of his dad.
Yeah, exactly. I think that room, the dining hall, had sort of had it felt no longer important. The story had ended for it, and not that his father and the story of his father and his brothers still haunts him, but it's not, the space didn't feel appropriate for that bit.
It's the end of this episode of Once Upon a TV Time, but not of our chat with Andres Cubillan. We had so much to talk about that I'm splitting this episode into 2 parts, so come back next time to hear the rest of our conversation about the Vampire Lestat. And until then, go watch some television.